Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. Senator Portman, welcome back to the show, sir.
Chuck,
I want to start with Roy Moore. I know you have said you do not believe he should be a candidate. You have called for him to step aside. You have said you believe the accusers. The President of the United States says, in fact, in a new tweet, says the last thing we need in Alabama and the U.S. Senate is a Schumer-Pelosi puppet who is weak on crime, weak on the border, bad for our military and our great vets, bad for our Second Amendment, and wants to raises taxes to the sky. That's his words there in the tweet. Jones would be a disaster. Do you agree with the president that it is better if Alabamans elect somebody who's been accused of being a child molester over a Democrat simply due to ideology?
Well, I stand with what I said earlier, which is I think it'd be best if he stepped aside. And by the way, I think the president said that initially. I think that'd be better for the country. And, you know, the election's in a few weeks here, or a couple weeks maybe. And, you know, there's a possibility for folks to do write-in candidates. So we'll see. But no, I think it'd be best if he stepped aside.
If you were a voter in Alabama, what would you do? Jeff Flake said he'd vote Democrat if Roy Moore was the only other option.
Well, I'd probably vote for a Republican, but it wouldn't be Roy Moore.
No, you would cast that vote knowing it probably throws the election, that, you know, the more Republicans split their vote. You're okay if a Democrat gets elected there as long as it's not Roy Moore?
Yeah, look, Chuck, as you know, I endorsed the other guy, Luther Strange. I thought he would have been a terrific senator. He's my colleague now. I never endorsed Roy Moore. When these allegations came out, I did say that as Moore came out and as the women went on the record, I thought there was a lot of credibility in what they were saying. And I didn't find the response very credible, and that's how I came up with my position.
Scott Jennings, a Republican strategist who I think lives on the border of Ohio and Kentucky, so you may know him very well, said this in the New York Times this weekend about this Roy Moore situation. Either we're saddled with a Democrat in a seat that ought to be Republican, or we're saddled with a brand anvil that's going to drag down the president, drag down the Senate, drag down the party, and plunge the Senate into immediate turmoil when he gets there. Is it worse for the Republican Party, Senator Portman, if Roy Moore wins or loses?
I don't know. I'll let the talking heads like Scott talk about that. What I do think is that, you know, it would be best if he were to step aside. And look, we have an opportunity, as Nancy Pelosi just said, to pass tax reform. I think she has misrepresented everything in that tax reform proposal as an example, but we've got some great opportunities here, and we'll move forward with these regardless of what happens. But I do think that it'd be best if he stepped aside.
The Senate, Senator Franken, one of your colleagues, obviously on the other side of the aisle, he called for a Senate ethics investigation into himself. I think you concurred with that. What do you believe should be the threshold of whether he should still serve or not?
Well, the ethics investigation ought to go forward, and we ought to, you know, get to all the facts, just as in the case of John Conyers. This was talked about earlier. I hope we see action on that even this week. And, you know, we'll see what the facts are. I don't know all the facts. I don't think all those are public yet. I do think all of this, as difficult as it is in some respects for our society, is really important, because I think it will end up changing people's attitudes and changing our culture. So I'm glad it's being discussed. I think it should be more transparent. I certainly think that if you accept taxpayer funds for a settlement, that should be transparent. I think it should be prohibited, by the way, first. Would you
support retroactively making all of these settlements public when you guys address this situation in Congress?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I would. I would. And look, I think it's outrageous that the taxpayers are asked to pay these settlements in the first place. And yeah, we should make transparent what's happened.
Do you believe the accusers of Donald Trump?
Well, as you know, at the end of the election, when the tape came out that you played earlier, I chose to support a different candidate than Donald Trump because of that. So, you know, you've got to have a process. I agree due process is important, but we also have to be sure that victims have the right to be able to come forward, that there's transparency here with regard to the situation in the House and Senate. Outrageous to me that over the years there has been taxpayer funding used for settlements without any notification or transparency. And also I think it's wrong the way victims are treated, because they have to go through a laborious process. And it's true that some victims would prefer to keep it private. That's fine. They should have the right to do that. But they should also have an expedited process to be able to bring their complaints.
Between the election of Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape and Roy Moore in Alabama. Voters send Roy Moore to the Senate. And I know you want a Senate ethics investigation into him if he gets sent to the Senate. But what are the voters saying about our moral lines?
Well, it's a fair question. I think voters care a lot about the policy issues. The president talked about those this morning in that tweet that you mentioned, and that includes tax reform. It includes, how you deal with the debt and deficit. It includes a lot of issues that are very important to people that are on the social side, issues like abortion, issues like gun control. So, voters are going to make those decisions based on a lot of different factors, but one certainly is character. And I think the American people deserve to have the highest standards of ethical conduct by their elected officials, period.
Okay, but if the voters send back people that you believe ethically or morally are unsuited for the Senate, do you believe the Senate should expel those folks? Or do you think the voters, hey, you have to respect the right of the voters on that one?
Well, it's an important question, but that's why you have an ethics committee. And I served on the ethics committee when I was in the House, went through that same process. The person who was the subject of that ethics committee process, by the way, was defeated in his reelection because of the information that we were able to provide to the voters of that district. So I think there is a way for this ethics process to work. It needs to be expedited, as I said. We need to get moving on it quickly.
All right.
That needs to provide due process, but it also needs to provide the transparency so that voters know what the situation is.
I got to ask you about an issue that impacts actually the state of Ohio and involves an Ohioan. The Consumer Financial Protection Board used to be run by a gentleman named Richard Cordray. He's since resigned. He's going to go run, I believe, likely to run for governor of your home state of Ohio as a Democrat. He designated a deputy director, and the president has designated now, I guess, an acting director. Who, in your opinion, is in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Board come Monday morning? The current deputy is the acting director, or do you believe President Trump's decision to put Mick Mulvaney there is legal?
Well, first of all, my understanding is that Richard Cordray resigned a week earlier than he was planning to in order to put his deputy in charge. Trying to circumvent the normal process would be that the president would have the ability to appoint somebody on an interim basis until Congress confirms a new director. So my hope is that we won't play those kind of games, that we'll have an interim process here, and that would be Mick Mulvaney or somebody else the president chooses, and then Congress will get busy in confirming a new director.
Mick Mulvaney basically has mocked the Consumer Financial Protection Board. Is he really the right person to put in charge right now as acting director? And by the way, you've been budget director, but can you do both jobs? I mean, it's unrealistic, right?
Well, I'm sure there'll be somebody working the operations day-to-day. But look, Chuck, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has come under a lot of pressure because of the way it was established. It has no accountability. In other words, unlike other boards and oversight organizations, there is no appropriation, so there's no way for Congress or the voters, through their members of Congress, to affect the decisions. It's very unusual. They get their funds directly from the Federal Reserve. Second, there's no board or commission. There's nothing bipartisan about it. And third, there's an issue about the director and whether the president has the ability without cause to be able to replace that director. All of those are issues. I've introduced legislation actually to provide an inspector general. They have no inspector general, as an example. So it is an unusual organization, and I think it is inconsistent with the accountability that's in the federal government otherwise, and I think that's a big problem. But I do think there needs to be a new director confirmed, and we should do that quickly.
All right. I'm going to leave it there. Senator Portman, Republican from Ohio. A lot we tried to get to today, and we don't always get to all of it. I appreciate you coming on.
Chuck, but since Nancy Pelosi talked about the tax bill, can I just talk about the middle-class tax cuts are in there, the economic growth is in there. It's an excellent opportunity for us to fix a broken tax code.
Do you acknowledge that not everybody's taxes are going down, that the middle class, that some in the middle to upper middle class will see their total tax bill go up when you account for state and local as well?
It doubles the standard deduction up to $24,000 for a family. It doubles the child tax credit. It lowers the rates to the point that in Ohio the average is $2,375 for the median income family. And everybody in every group, Chuck, in every bracket, that group as a whole will see tax cuts. And so, it's just been misrepresented. And I hope people will go online and look for themselves. Go on to the Joint Committee on Taxation's website, jct.gov. That's the one that's official.
Okay.
And check out what your own situation is. And you'll see it has substantial middle-class tax cuts For a family of two making 50 grand a year, it's a 28% tax cut.
I let both you and Leader Pelosi go probably far too long than my executive producer wanted. Anyway, Senator Portman, thank you very much.